Data from the Study of Women's Health Across the Nation, a landmark longitudinal study that followed over 3,000 women through menopause, found that insulin resistance increased by approximately 11% in the 2 years immediately following the final menstrual period, independent of weight gain, independent of diet, independent of exercise habits. The metabolic environment changed, and for most of those women, nobody explained why their body had stopped responding the way it used to.
Hi, I'm Suki Yamamoto, wellness specialist.
And I'm Marcus Reid, your senior health coach. No fads, no miracle claims. Just what the research actually shows and what it looks like in practice. Here is the narrative most women over 60 have been given about weight gain. You are eating too much. You are not moving enough. You lack the discipline you had when you were younger. If you just restricted more, you would see results. That narrative is not only incomplete. For a significant number of women over 60, acting on it, cutting calories sharply, actively makes the underlying problem worse. Today, Suki and I are going to explain the biological mechanism behind why that is the case. Not to let anyone off the hook for anything, but because treating a biological problem with a willpower solution produces frustration, not results.
What we are covering today is insulin resistance, the metabolic shift that occurs after menopause, the mechanism by which it drives fat storage, and specifically why standard caloric restriction does not address it and can in some cases compound it.
By the end of this, you will have 3 specific things. 1 test to ask your GP for that most standard blood panels do not include, but which detects this problem directly. 2 dietary changes with strong clinical evidence for improving insulin sensitivity in postmenopausal women, and 1 10-minute habit that has more evidence behind it than most supplements on the market. We are going to show you exactly why each one matters.
And I want to be precise from the beginning. We are not saying that calories do not matter. We are saying that for women over 60 with insulin resistance, calorie counting alone is addressing the wrong mechanism. That distinction matters.
Let's start at the beginning. What does insulin actually do?
Insulin is a hormone produced by the pancreas in response to rising blood glucose, primarily after eating. Its job is to signal cells to absorb glucose from the bloodstream, either to use immediately for energy or to store for later. Think of insulin as the key that unlocks the cell door to allow glucose to enter.
So when insulin is working properly, you eat, your blood glucose rises, insulin is released, the cells absorb the glucose, and blood glucose returns to normal.
That is the functional cycle. Insulin resistance is what happens when the cells stop responding efficiently to that signal. The key no longer turns the lock as easily. The pancreas responds by producing more insulin, trying harder to get the cells to open up. For a period, this compensates, but chronically elevated insulin levels have a specific downstream consequence that is directly relevant to fat storage.
Which is?
Insulin is a storage hormone. When insulin levels are elevated, the body is in storage mode. It actively suppresses fat burning and promotes fat deposition. You cannot efficiently access stored fat for energy when insulin is high. So a woman with insulin resistance is not simply storing more fat, she is also blocked from burning the fat she already has. The metabolic environment is tilted toward accumulation.
Where does estrogen fit into this?
Estrogen directly enhances insulin sensitivity through a specific mechanism. Cells absorb glucose via transporter proteins called GLUT4. Think of these as the individual locks on the cell door. Estrogen upregulates the expression of GLUT4 transporters, meaning cells produce more of them and respond more readily to insulin's signal.
So estrogen is essentially keeping the insulin system efficient.
It is one of the ways estrogen supports metabolic health, yes. After menopause, estrogen declines sharply. GLUT4 expression decreases. Cells become less responsive to insulin. The pancreas compensates with higher insulin output, and the metabolic shift the SWAN data describes, that 11% increase in measured insulin resistance in the 2 years immediately after the final period, is the quantified result of that process.
And the critical point is that this is happening independent of what someone is eating.
Independent of weight gain, independent of dietary changes. The hormonal withdrawal is the primary driver. Dietary choices can accelerate or slow the trajectory, but the underlying shift is hormonal. That is why addressing it with diet alone, or with willpower alone, is incomplete.
So someone who ate well and exercised consistently before menopause and finds that nothing is working afterwards. It is not that their habits became ineffective overnight. The biological context changed.
That is a precise summary. The same inputs are producing different outputs because the metabolic environment is different. Understanding that does not mean the inputs are irrelevant. It means the inputs need to be targeted at the new environment, not the old one.
You mentioned GLUT4 transporters in muscle cells specifically. Is there a muscle component to this?
This is the second mechanism, and it connects directly to the episode we did on sarcopenia. Skeletal muscle is the primary site of glucose disposal in the body. After a meal, approximately 80% of the glucose absorbed from food is taken up by muscle tissue. Muscle cells are the dominant consumer of blood glucose. The more functional muscle mass you have, the more capacity your body has to clear glucose from the bloodstream efficiently.
So if you lose muscle mass after 60, which we established in the sarcopenia episode happens at approximately 3 to 5% per decade without intervention, you are also losing glucose disposal capacity.
Correct. Less muscle means less capacity to absorb circulating glucose. More glucose remains in the bloodstream after meals. The pancreas produces more insulin to compensate. Insulin resistance deepens, and this creates a cycle that the SWAN data reflects. The muscle loss we discussed in the context of strength and mobility is simultaneously creating the metabolic conditions that make fat loss progressively more difficult.
So it is not two separate problems, muscle loss and weight gain. They are the same problem expressing itself in different ways.
They share a common mechanism, and the interventions overlap. What improves insulin sensitivity also tends to preserve and build muscle, which is why the protocol we will describe later is not a diet protocol. It is a metabolic protocol.
What does the cycle look like for someone who does not know this is happening?
She notices weight gain in her early to mid-60s that does not respond to the calorie restriction that worked in her 40s. She restricts further. The restriction raises cortisol, the stress hormone. Elevated cortisol triggers gluconeogenesis, the liver releasing stored glucose into the bloodstream to provide emergency energy. Blood glucose rises. Insulin rises in response. Insulin resistance deepens. And because a severe calorie deficit also causes muscle tissue to be broken down for energy, she loses muscle mass, which further reduces her glucose disposal capacity. The restriction is compounding the problem it was intended to solve.
Wait, so cutting calories hard, which is what most people instinctively do, can actually accelerate the insulin resistance?
Through the cortisol gluconeogenesis pathway, yes, particularly with severe restriction. I want to be careful not to overstate this. A modest, sustainable calorie reduction is not harmful and may be helpful. The problem is the instinct toward aggressive restriction when progress stalls. That is where the evidence suggests the mechanism can work against you.
This is the piece that nobody explains, and it is why people feel like they are doing everything right and still failing. They are not failing. They are applying the right tool to the wrong problem. I want to push back on something slightly, because fundamentally physics still applies. If you consume less energy than you expend, you have to lose weight. That is thermodynamics.
The first law of thermodynamics applies at the level of physics. You are correct about that. The complexity is in how the body responds to the calorie deficit, which is not passive. When calorie intake drops significantly, the body does not simply draw down fat reserves. It makes a series of hormonal adaptations. Metabolic rate slows, muscle breakdown increases to provide energy, cortisol rises. In a young person with high insulin sensitivity and substantial muscle mass, these adaptations are modest. In a postmenopausal woman with existing insulin resistance and reduced muscle mass, they are pronounced. Same thermodynamic principle, vastly different physiological response.
So the equation is the same, but the variables change.
The inputs and outputs both change. The body is not a passive container. It actively modifies both sides of the equation, how much energy it spends and where it draws that energy from. Someone with insulin resistance who enters a severe calorie deficit may lose weight initially, but a disproportionate share of that loss comes from muscle tissue rather than fat, which worsens insulin sensitivity and makes the next phase of weight loss harder. That is not a violation of thermodynamics. It is the body's metabolic adaptation to restriction playing out inside the thermodynamic equation.
I understand the correction, and it changes the strategy completely, because if the goal is fat loss specifically, not just weight loss, then protecting muscle and improving insulin sensitivity has to come first. The fat loss follows. It does not lead.
That is the key clinical reframe. Insulin sensitivity first, the metabolic environment second, fat loss as the downstream outcome of improving both.
Let's go through the 3 interventions, starting with the GP conversation.
The test most women have never been offered is fasting insulin. Standard metabolic panels include fasting glucose, which measures blood sugar at a single point in time and does not detect insulin resistance until it is severe. Fasting insulin, combined with fasting glucose, allows calculation of a score called HOMA-IR, Homeostatic Model Assessment of Insulin Resistance. This score detects insulin resistance years before fasting glucose becomes abnormal. You can have a completely normal fasting glucose reading and a HOMA-IR score indicating significant insulin resistance.
So by the time your blood sugar test comes back abnormal, the problem has been there for years.
Potentially, yes. HOMA-IR is not universally included in standard blood panels, but it is a simple calculated score. It requires only fasting insulin and fasting glucose values, both of which are standard blood tests. Ask your GP specifically for a fasting insulin level alongside your standard fasting glucose. If they are willing to calculate or provide the HOMA-IR score, that is the most useful single number for understanding where you stand.
And why does knowing your HOMA-IR score matter practically?
Because it tells you whether the interventions we are about to describe are specifically relevant to you, and it gives you a baseline against which to measure improvement. The research consistently shows HOMA-IR improves measurably within 8 to 12 weeks of targeted intervention, even when the scale has not moved. If you do not have the baseline number, you cannot see the improvement, and seeing the improvement matters for motivation and for evidence-based adjustment of the approach.
What is the second intervention?
Protein timing. Specifically, the order in which macronutrients are consumed within a meal. A 2015 study by Shukla and colleagues published in Diabetes Care examined the effect of eating protein and vegetables before carbohydrates in the same meal, compared to eating carbohydrates first. The result, eating protein first, reduced the post-meal glucose peak by approximately 37% and reduced the insulin response by 16%. Same meal, same calories, different order.
That is a significant difference for something that costs nothing and takes no extra time.
The mechanism is gastric emptying. Protein slows the rate at which the stomach empties into the small intestine, which slows glucose absorption and blunts the spike. The practical implication is straightforward. Eat the protein and vegetables on your plate before the carbohydrates. Not a different meal, not calorie restriction, a different sequence.
And breakfast specifically?
Breakfast is the highest leverage meal for insulin sensitivity. Cortisol is naturally highest in the morning, part of the body's normal daily rhythm. Cortisol raises blood glucose. Starting the day with a high carbohydrate breakfast on top of that elevated cortisol creates a compounded glucose spike, starting with 25 to 30 grams of protein, eggs, Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, smoked fish, blunts that morning spike and improves insulin response for the remainder of the day. This is not a marginal benefit. A 2022 review in Nutrients found that high-protein breakfasts in postmenopausal women were associated with significantly better glycemic control across the full day compared to high-carbohydrate breakfasts of equal calories.
What is the third intervention, the 10-minute habit you mentioned earlier?
Post-meal walking. A 2022 meta-analysis published in Sports Medicine reviewed 7 randomized controlled trials examining the effect of short walks after meals on blood glucose. The finding, walking for as little as 2 to 5 minutes after eating reduced post-meal blood glucose spikes by up to 30%, and 10-minute walks produced the most consistent results across all studies.
10 minutes. That is not a workout. That is a stroll around the block.
The mechanism is important to understand because it is distinct from general exercise benefits. When muscle fibers contract during walking, they activate GLUT4 transporters independently of insulin. The muscle cells absorb glucose directly without requiring the insulin signal that is impaired in insulin resistance. Walking after a meal is essentially bypassing the insulin bottleneck by giving glucose somewhere to go through a completely different pathway.
So you are solving the problem at the point of entry, right when the glucose from a meal is entering the bloodstream, rather than waiting for insulin to deal with it.
That is the mechanism precisely, and the timing matters. The post-meal glucose peak occurs approximately 30 to 60 minutes after eating. A walk starting within 15 to 20 minutes of finishing a meal intercepts that peak directly. A walk 2 hours later misses it.
So, finish eating, wait no more than 15 or 20 minutes, walk for 10 minutes. That is the habit.
That is the habit. And for women who are resistant to the idea of formal exercise, which is a real and understandable barrier, this framing removes the exercise identity issue entirely. This is not a workout. It is a metabolic management tool with a specific documented mechanism and evidence behind it.
I want to ask about the dietary pattern more broadly, because we have talked about protein timing and post-meal walking, but what about the overall composition of what people eat?
The most important dietary shift for insulin sensitivity is not calorie reduction. It is glycemic management. Specifically, reducing the rate and magnitude of blood glucose spikes across the day. 2 practical approaches have good evidence. The first is dietary fiber sequencing, eating fiber-rich vegetables at the beginning of a meal before starchy carbohydrates. A 2015 study in the Journal of Diabetes Care found that eating vegetables and salad before rice reduced the post-meal glucose spike by approximately 30%, the same mechanism as protein sequencing, different macronutrient.
So the sequence is fiber first, protein second, carbohydrates last.
That is the sequence with the strongest evidence. The second is vinegar, specifically consuming a small amount of vinegar before or during a high-carbohydrate meal. A 2004 study by Johnston and colleagues published in Diabetes Care found that 20 milliliters of apple cider vinegar taken before a high-carbohydrate meal reduced the post-meal glucose response by approximately 34%.
Wait, apple cider vinegar is one of those things that gets turned into a wellness marketing product very quickly. Is this actually real?
The mechanism is real and well characterized. Acetic acid, the active component of vinegar, inhibits alpha amylase and other enzymes responsible for breaking down starch into glucose. It slows the digestion and absorption of carbohydrates, reducing the glucose spike. The effect is clinically meaningful in studies. The challenge is that the wellness industry has extrapolated this mechanism into much broader claims: fat burning, detoxification, alkalizing the body, that the evidence does not support. The specific documented effect is glycemic management at the point of a high carbohydrate meal. That is what the research shows, nothing more and nothing less.
How much and how?
1 to 2 tablespoons, 15 to 30 milliliters, diluted in a full glass of water, consumed 5 to 10 minutes before a high carbohydrate meal. Not after, not at random intervals. The timing relative to the meal is what activates the enzyme inhibiting effect, and it should always be diluted. Undiluted vinegar is acidic enough to damage tooth enamel and the esophagus with repeated use.
Let's talk honestly about the timeline. Someone starts these changes today. What do they see and when?
The first thing to understand is that the sequence of improvement is metabolic markers first, scale second. In the research literature on insulin sensitivity interventions in postmenopausal women, HOMAIR typically shows measurable improvement within 8 to 12 weeks of consistent intervention before significant weight change is visible on the scale. This is why the baseline test matters. If you have the HOMA-IR number, you can see the mechanism improving even when the scale has not moved.
So someone doing everything right might not see scale movement for the first 6 to 8 weeks.
That is plausible, and it is important to say this directly because the absence of scale movement in that initial period is frequently interpreted as failure and leads to abandonment of the approach, often just before the downstream fat loss would have become visible.
That is the exact point where most people quit.
It is, and the biology supports persistence, not abandonment. As insulin sensitivity improves, the metabolic environment shifts from storage mode toward fat utilization. Fat loss follows normalization of the insulin environment. It does not precede it. The sequence matters.
And for someone who does all of this and still does not see improvement after 12 weeks?
That is a conversation for a GP or an endocrinologist. There are medical conditions, thyroid dysfunction, polycystic ovary syndrome in younger postmenopausal women, adrenal dysfunction, that can maintain insulin resistance despite lifestyle intervention. The HOMAIR baseline and the 12-week retest give you evidence to bring to that conversation. You are not arriving empty-handed. You are arriving with data.
We are not making a weight loss guarantee. We are saying the mechanism is real. The interventions have clinical evidence behind them, and addressing the actual problem produces better outcomes than addressing the narrative about it.
And the most important first step is not a new diet plan. The most important first step is to ask your GP for a fasting insulin level and understand what you are actually dealing with before you decide how to address it.
Let's bring it home. Today we explained why dieting alone does not work for many women over 60, and why the explanation is not willpower. After menopause, estrogen withdrawal directly reduces insulin sensitivity. Less muscle mass, the inevitable consequence of aging without targeted intervention, reduces the body's capacity to clear glucose. Aggressive calorie restriction raises cortisol, which raises blood glucose, which raises insulin, which deepens the resistance. The tools most people reach for are working against the mechanism they are trying to address.
The evidence-supported protocol is ask your GP for a fasting insulin level and a HOMAIR calculation as your diagnostic baseline. Apply protein first, fiber first meal sequencing to reduce the magnitude of post-meal glucose spikes without changing what you eat. Use a 10-minute walk within 15 to 20 minutes of finishing a meal to activate muscle glucose uptake independently of insulin. And consider a tablespoon of diluted vinegar before high-carbohydrate meals as a practical, low-cost glycemic management tool. Allow a minimum of 8 to 12 weeks before evaluating outcomes, and measure HOMA-IR, not just the scale.
The mechanism is real. The interventions have evidence. The timeline requires patience. But you are not fighting your biology. You are finally working with it.
And if this episode raised questions that feel specific to your situation, symptoms that have not responded to standard advice, or results that feel disproportionate to your effort, those questions belong with a physician who can review your full medical picture. We can explain the mechanism. We cannot substitute for a clinical assessment.
If this was useful, the like button genuinely helps more people find it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss next week.